Hi, everyone. Welcome to this session of Talking Tech, Women and Girls in ICT. I'm Andrea, and today we're delighted to have a special guest to chat with us about what goes on in the world of innovation and technology. First, a little bit about Talking Tech. It is a series celebrating women in tech on the fourth Thursday of every April, and it's called Girls in ICT Day. The aim is to help create a global environment that empowers young women to consider studies and their careers in the field of IT. I know one amazing woman who has impacted the technology and innovation industry drastically, and she's none other than Professor Sue Newell. Sue is an associate dean. She heads the Information Systems Group at Warwick Business School, a fellow of the Association for Information Systems, and she also ranks among the world's top 2% of scientists. Hi, Sue. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Andrea. Lovely to be here.
Okay, so to kick things off, would you mind telling us what do you enjoy most about being in the information systems space and what got you into it at the start?
Great. Good question. I guess one of the things that I find most exciting being in the information systems area, and information systems is the discipline where we look at the development and impacts of information technology or digital technology, as it's sometimes referred to now, in the business world and beyond, because business has repercussions for the whole of society. So, one of the reasons why I find it exciting to be in this domain is because it never stands still. Digital technology is constantly changing, and new products, new services, new business models are evolving almost daily, it seems. And the pandemic perhaps has accelerated some of this, something that we might talk about as we move on. But it's because of that constant change that there's always new things to look at and explore. So, just as an example of that, some of my more recent research has been looking at artificial intelligence and what's sometimes described as algorithmic decision making. That is where you use data that is created from the constant connectivity that we all experience now, because we're connected through the smartwatches that we wear, the mobile technology that we use, and increasingly a whole host of other products and services that we use on a daily basis. And that data is then used to make predictions and actually increasingly to make decisions, so that rather than have humans, and humans should always kind of make decisions based on evidence, but that is increasingly being usurped, or maybe usurped is a politically kind of dangerous word to use, but is being kind of taken over by algorithms who are making those decisions, whether it comes to financial decisions or whether it comes to decisions about what markets to enter and how to modify your product. So I think that these changes are really important for us to study as information systems scholars, because they have impacts. They have impacts on the nature of work. They have impact on the number of people in particular types of jobs. And so they have profound effects, not just on business, but on society more broadly. And I think as information scholars, our remit is to try and understand those different impacts so that we can have a discussion at a societal level about the ways we want that digital technology to be used in the future. Well, now, actually, not just in the future, actually now. That's kind of why I'm interested in this area.
That's really cool. I think when you mentioned about how information systems is not a standstill, and probably yourself being in the industry for more than 32 years. In fact, I'm not sure if you would have considered AI at the start of your career 32 years ago.
No, definitely not. It wasn't even on the cards, basically. I mean, yes, computers were being used, but they were being used in a much more kind of communication oriented way, rather than in this more invasive way that they penetrate all the products and services that we use and the very nature and ways in which we work. So, yeah, it's a very different world now.
I see. And well, when your career started 32 years ago, what was the main focus of information systems at that time versus now in AI?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things, for example, that we were looking at then was the use of computers in particular departments to automate certain functions. So
Mhm.
whether that was finance or production processes or supply chain management. And those kinds of systems were being used increasingly to kind of make more efficient particular functions. And from that then evolved into kind of enterprise systems where you try to integrate that data into a centralized database so that decisions that were made in kind of manufacturing process would automatically update supply chain information, which would automatically update the financial systems and so on. So it was that integration of technologies across a business and how you could make sure that integration occurred efficiently and effectively. And the interest that I had in that was that there were lots of both professional societies and software suppliers who were selling these technologies, these systems, as kind of revolutionary ways in which your firm could kind of suddenly dramatically become more efficient and effective and therefore profitable. But actually what we saw was that companies were introducing these technologies, but were struggling to actually get value from them. In fact, in some cases, it actually caused bankruptcy of the firm because they spent such a lot on the technology solutions, but they lost sight of what they were trying to do in terms of the value for their customers, or the technology solution actually didn't provide the efficiencies. Now, there were lots of reasons for that in terms of the ways they were being implemented. The use of consultants, for example, was very heavy. And so you would bring in a consultant, the consultant would kind of do all the planning for you, do all the software design, and then implement it and then go off. And then companies realized that they didn't know really actually anything about the systems and how they could use them to really exploit the data that was being produced now by these information systems. And so there was a recognition that it isn't just an implementation, it's a learning process, a journey that companies have to go on. And some companies, one case that we looked at, the company almost failed and decided to get rid of their ERP system. But in the end, they'd spent so much money on it, they realized that actually maybe they should try and exploit it. So they brought in some more consultants after the first ones had left. They brought in some more consultants. And then over time, they were able to actually use the system in a way that actually did benefit. But it took a lot of time. It took a lot of engagement, learning from the users. That's one of the big things. We might come back to this. But, very often companies think that the managers know best. But actually, they don't necessarily understand the work that the workers at different levels are actually doing. And so they implement the systems that make the life of the everyday worker more difficult, not less difficult. And then they're surprised why the users don't use them. So it's that whole thing about understanding the actual work rather than the kind of top-down picture of what is happening in an organization. So I think all of those things, and they're not really that different now. We can be talking about different kinds of systems. So maybe it's an AI system, an algorithmic decision-making system, or maybe it's a social media system. But those same issues about, well, what is the technology actually going to do to the work that is being done? And is there ways in which this technology actually is detracting rather than enhancing that work? And unless you actually build in that conversation with the workers, then you're not really going to be effective in implementing those. So to give a more recent example, we talked about kind of enterprise system as kind of 10, 20 years ago. Now we might have a social media, an organization thinks, right, we're going to introduce a social media platform so that we can get more communication. That's the whole idea of social media, that it's not a authority communicating to an audience, but it's that kind of co-creation of information and knowledge. And so organizations introduce social media platforms, which they say, anyone can talk to anyone. And, I'm the CEO, you can talk to me about anything. But actually they find that workers don't. Because if I've got a problem, I'm not necessarily going to be open with the CEO because I might feel that CEO has more power than I do. Probably truthfully. So you need to be able to understand how that dynamic works in a particular organization if that social media platform is going to lead to the greater communication and therefore innovation potential that it could potentially do. So that's just one example of more recent. And then you've got the algorithmic decision making that we've kind of briefly touched on, again, where organizations are using it. But then they're realizing that actually it has some downsides because it can only predict the future based on the past. And if the future somehow is different, then it's not going to be very helpful. So, one of the things we looked at in a paper a few years ago was, the financial crash in 2007-8. And actually, part of that was related to algorithmic decision making over CDOs, so securities, and how they were, evaluated, and valued. And that was because they were using past data, and past data was changing because of the way mortgages and loans were being made in the immediate era before that. But then they hadn't changed the algorithm, because the algorithm didn't know that. It could only use the data from the past. So, lots of examples of how organizations have used technology unwisely. There's this idea of mindful innovation. We talked about it in our class. And many organizations don't innovate with digital technology mindfully. They do it mindlessly because someone else has done it and it looks good from someone else's perspective. They don't think about what it could do in their specific organization and how they could make sure that they exploit it effectively.
That's true. I like what you mentioned about innovating mindfully, because a lot of, I guess, young girls like me out there who haven't heard you speak before, we always thought that, ooh, the newest and latest gadgets will change our lives to be better. But I guess there has to be more thought put into the purpose and how the technology can serve you to achieve those goals. So this brings me to my next question. That there are a lot of innovations out there, maybe like Tesla or Alexa, life-changing, super great. But then behind those glitz and glamour of life-changing products, there's actually a team who brings these innovations to life. And how do you think this balance between technology and human interaction and teamwork helps to create good and greater life-changing products?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I think we know there's a difference between invention, and that can be sometimes a great mind, and innovation, because innovation is the whole process. I guess that's partly what I was talking about. Innovation isn't creating the internet, it's how we use the internet in our everyday lives or in business or whatever. So innovation is a process, and it's very much an iterative process. So it doesn't, you don't know when you start an innovation project how it will end up. You might think you do, and that's sometimes the problem, because you've got a very clear vision, but you don't necessarily understand fully how that vision can be, fully materialized. And actually, as you start working on the project, then things will likely change. And one of the problems, I think, with a lot of, it's not just digital technology projects, but they do tend to suffer perhaps more than other projects, is that you start with this overly deterministic idea of what you will end up with, when actually you're better off to kind of understand things as you go. And that's why there's been such an increase in the use of what's called agile methodologies in software development. So it's the idea that you don't, the old way was waterfall, all right? You had to start, you had to get a really, really precise user requirements analysis, so you knew exactly what the technology was going to do. And then when you've done all that, you then did all the software development and all the testing, and then finally you rolled it out as a big bang. This is it. This is the new product. This is the new way we're going to do things. Whereas today with Agile, it's recognizing that actually it's better to do a bit, to try it out, to see how users react to it, and then go back and make some changes, and then build the next bit of software, rather than kind of this big bang approach. And that requires a team. Now, one of you ask about the team. The team is really important. The team needs to have different skills. It will have some people with hard technical coding, skills. But there's a lot of other skills that are required in those projects. They're to do with kind of risk management. How do you make sure that, and those are not just technical risks, they are also social and human risks that we need to think about as well. And then there's also that engagement with the user that I was talking about. And one of the problems, I think, with that user engagement, of course, it's really important. I've already kind of emphasized why we need to understand the user. But users sometimes themselves,
they don't know what they want.
Yeah, exactly. They don't know what they want, and they can't appreciate what the technology could do for them. So that's why I think this kind of more iterative approach can be very useful, because it gives users a taste of things, and then they can see what they might be able to do with it, and they can be then involved in that innovation process. You asked about how things have changed, and I guess one of the things we didn't talk about was this whole idea of kind of a more open innovation process, and open not just in the sense of open beyond the boundaries of an organization. So when we talk about open innovation in the information systems literature, we tend to talk about it in terms of involving people beyond the organizational boundary, so the crowd. But actually, open innovation can also relate to within the organization, having more involvement from a broader range of people within. So you might have a project team, but if you're not in that project team and you're a user, you can be just as important to the development of a new technology as being in the project. If you're one of those who kind of really engages with it, tries to kind of understand how that technology could make your job and the organization views that you're trying to create from that effective. So it's kind of, sometimes you can be in vastly different roles and yet still have an impact. And go back to your question of how do we use technology to make big changes. Of course, we do want to use technology for kind of fundamental changes to society, but we can also use them in small incremental ways that make improvements to people's lives in the everyday. And sometimes these are tiny. They don't even require a massive project. It's just kind of you in your work and your understanding of technology being able to say, wow, if we did this, then it would make things so much more effective. Now, sometimes you're wrong. Basically, you might have a great idea and then you realize that's not going to work in practice. So you always need to be a little bit kind of skeptical of your own ideas. But nevertheless, putting them forward, discussing them with others, and then thinking about how you might implement them can be just as important in an organizational context as kind of being involved in a mega project that's going to kind of change the fortunes of an organization or even of a society. So I would say, think small as well as big, and they're not mutually exclusive. We can find ways to improve our everyday life with digital technology, as well as thinking about how we can use digital technology in a more kind of sustaining way.
I think this is a really good tip for our viewers out there, because then they don't need to feel the pressure to be in the industry itself, but they can also innovate in many different types of industries like accounting, finance, legal. All they need to do is just take baby steps and try to improve things better than the way it was before, maybe using digital technologies to help them.
Yeah, absolutely. And that does mean having an understanding of digital technology as well. And, because there's a concept in information systems called the affordances of a technology. A technology allows certain things, and some of those things are good, but some of them are bad as well. So if you take the example of social media, that's a massive issue for us now in society, because social media is creating these, it's not the only thing that's doing it, but divisions in society and kind of angry mobs that are kind of, discussing and not discussing, actually just beating each other up on social media about different topics. And it's because social media affords that in a more global way than in the past. We could always write letters to newspapers, but the letters would be edited and some of them would get in and some of them wouldn't. But now you can put anything you want on social media. Well, not quite anything, but near enough anything that you want on social media. And you can kind of incite other people in a non-productive way. More importantly, go back to the algorithms, social media, you don't get to see everything. You get to see what the social media company decides that you will like. And so it creates these kind of more blinkered understandings of the world, because you tend to get those communications that are seen to be things that you are going to be liking and kind of have common views. And so you don't get a bigger picture. And that's a massive issue for us as a society. So, as an everyday user, part of that is about thinking, well, should I really be kind of responding in that ultra negative way? Can I have some empathy for what that other person is saying and not kind of continue to only see the world from my perspective and try and be more open? And that's a challenge for all of us, to kind of try and not be as blinkered because of social media and the way it actually exacerbates some of those tensions that exist already.
That's true. I think girls like me growing up, we always feel like what we see is the 100% truth, and what we don't see probably, doesn't exist. So in this age, I think we need to really build up our critical thinking skills to discern, two points of view. There's not always a single answer to life, and we got to be a little bit more
Absolutely.
open to other people's point of view. That's really
Yeah.
cool. Okay,
Absolutely.
so when we're talking about social media, I'll bring myself to the last question. As the Associate Dean of the University of Warwick, what do you think are the differences between a formal education in information systems versus learning technicalities through social media like YouTube, Facebook live videos, or online courses like Udemy?
I think that those resources are really helpful, because they can, if you don't have the same access to education, then you can now teach yourself essentially. Massive MOOCs and other kind of YouTube resources are there, so you can teach yourself to code. You can teach yourself to mend anything almost, can't you, nowadays, and to develop anything. Um, but I think what is more difficult to learn through that kind of self-help, self-education, is that kind of critical thinking piece. I'm not saying it's impossible, because you can force yourself to kind of look at a very wide range of views on a topic. You can force yourself, but it's much more difficult to do that than to learn a technical solution to a particular problem. So I think access to that kind of hardcore technical knowledge can be very effective through various types of online education. But I still think there will be a role for higher education and education more generally, which is about bringing people together from different backgrounds. I mean, one of the things about Warwick, but many other universities, um, is that they are very, very international now. You know, we bring together, people from across the globe.
Right.
And people from across the globe are quite different in terms of their values, their experiences, and you have to learn to get to work together with those different people. And you can do it in an online environment, but it's not quite the same, because you don't get the chance to go for a coffee where you kind of just talk a little bit about your personal life and then begin to understand where a person is coming from. That is much more difficult to do in an online environment. So I think that understanding of difference, and that critical ability to kind of be critical of everything, but in a constructive way, not critical as in, oh, you're wrong, but critical as in, okay, how can I then build on different points of view and recognize that there are always going to be tensions in how we use digital technology. That's one of the things, hopefully, that you're learning in your course, is
Right.
that there's no right answers. There's any piece of technology that you want to look at from ever, even, go back to the wheel, has both its positive advantages, but also has some unintended, and that's, I think, what I haven't mentioned that yet, but that idea of unintended consequences is something that we really stress, I think, in our education, because you could never fully know how something will pan out in the longer term, and it's being kind of being mindful of those unintended consequences, as well as what you intended, that I think is really important, and part of how I think we can educate people moving forward.
That's really, really inspiring. I think, my conversations with you and even in your lectures, I'm really inspired by how you managed to humanize the technology element and bringing much more of a human touch of understanding different viewpoints, pros and cons of technical inventions and innovation. And I really hope our viewers out there can learn to understand how innovation and technology is not just about the technical elements, and it also has to do a lot with human interaction. So, Sue, before we end the interview, do you have any last words of advice for our viewers out there?
I do think at the moment, IT and information systems as well as a discipline is underrepresented in terms of women. And so, but yet it is a field that has so many opportunities, both on the hard side, the more technical side, and in terms of those soft human skills that are necessary if we are to really make use of digital technology to better the planet. So there's this whole thing around the planet and sustainability that technology can help us with, but also that kind of human understanding and social interaction. And there is so much opportunity there for people of a wide kind of range of skills and interests to get involved in information technology, whatever role it is that they are. So yeah, please kind of, yeah, embrace digital technology, but embrace it in a critical way. And then I think you will really benefit both yourself, but also, in your work role, kind of that those small incremental changes that you as an individual can introduce are as important as kind of being involved in some mega project that is supposedly going to change the world.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up now. That's all we have for you today, folks. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences with us, Sue. And for our viewers out there, I hope this session gave you a glimpse of what it's like to be in the tech industry and that you will be inspired to pursue an education or career in this field because we need more people like you to join the movement. This series is brought to you by the ITU, UNICC, and the Office of the UN Secretary General's Envoy of Youth. It is in support of the Equals Global Partnership for Gender Equality in the Digital Age. Bye!
Thanks, everyone.